So now I have a question. They're knotted together, right? As a doctor, what if you were on call? Is this some kind of conjoined twins situation where you gotta waddle your way to the hospital? Like, what happens? Welcome to a reading wrap-up where I will be telling you about the first 10 books I read of this year. This includes my first time reading Omegaverse, Miss Emily Wilde, some gothic YA, a bunch of other ebooks and audiobooks I listened to. There's a lot to cover, and usually I would save that for a cook and book video, but as I mentioned last time, I did lose my video files when I had a hard drive that no longer worked anymore. And that is a result of me not being careful of cybersecurity. Fortunately, the sponsor of today's video, Incogni, is here to help. In one of my recent videos, I mentioned that I lost my video files. It was actually completely my fault because I tried to download a movie. It ended up being malware, and that's why my hard drive no longer works. I know, I am really stupid. I acknowledge this, but even if you're a smart person, it's incredibly easy for your data to be compromised anyway. It's pretty much inevitable for people to sell your data. That's why we always get junk mail and data breaches and robocalls on our phones. So what Incogni does is basically reach out to data brokers on your behalf and repeatedly request them to remove your data. It's an automated process that saves you a bunch of time and energy, because otherwise if you do it manually, it would literally take years, and that's just to only do it once. So yes, Incogni is another subscription service, but I understand why, because people selling your data is a constant problem that you're gonna have for the rest of your life. Plus, in light of recent events for me, my dumb ass needs to be on top of it now. So if you wanna try Incogni with me and try to get our life together, you can use with Cindy as the code and link in my description below to get an exclusive 60% off deal at incogni.com/withcindy. And now let's get back to the video. So my first book of the year is a new book that came out called Starling House. It takes place in a small town in Kentucky where the only thing that's really known about it is this mysterious author that was super famous in the 19th century. She mysteriously disappeared, but before she vanished, a house popped up out of nowhere called the Starling House. So everyone in the town agrees that this is sketchy as fuck, let's stay away from this weird ass gothic mansion. The main character ends up having a job that involves cleaning the house, which means that she also has to interact with this surly man that is trapped there, but the longer that she spends time with this guy and this house, she finds that it actually kind of becomes like a new home to her. But as she's becoming more attached to the house, sketchy stuff is going on, and she has to dig up the secrets behind the house and the author in order to protect her new home. I will admit that I have almost dropped this book several times before. The main character is 27, but she talks like a teenager, and while there's nothing wrong with a voice or a writing style that's more juvenile, it's really hard for me as a reader to get into that because that's really not my thing. But in the beginning of the year, I was taking a plane ride, I had nothing else to read, and so I forced myself to read it, and that really helped me get used to the writing style because biases aside, the writing genuinely is really good. I'm usually not into gothic stories, but I really vibed with the atmosphere. It was very dreamy and dark, so I ended up enjoying the book a lot, and it's very ironic that the best part about this book to me was the writing, but that was actually the same reason why I almost dropped it. This really goes to show how fickle my brain can be, but every now and then when I give something a chance, it works out. Another book that I gave a chance that really worked out for me was Not That Bad. This was a book that I actually read a long time ago, and it did not hit for me, but I decided to listen to it as an audiobook, and that really just changed the whole game. What made the audiobook really hit for me was the fact that each essay was narrated by a different person, sometimes the actual writer themselves, and I felt like that made each story feel all the more personal. I also felt like the anthology was really well put together because you were getting stories from cis people, queer people, trans women, trans men. There were stories from victims of rape culture or lawyers who talked about rape trials and how they're often conducted in a very cold, unsympathetic way. They really dig up any kind of example of bad behavior or ways to slut shame you in order to blame the victim. There was another essay from a journalist that was talking about how rape was such a common thing when refugees are trying to flee from their homeland and try to get a better life for themselves. It's also in these small, everyday personal stories that you experience as a woman or femme presenting person where you do get harassed, you do get catcalled, and all of these little things build up into a bigger systemic issue. Listening to audiobook actually brought upon a lot of memories for me, and it's interesting that when I first read it, I actually didn't remember reading this book at all. So I almost wonder if like I had repressed a lot of things and maybe I just wasn't ready. What's interesting is that it didn't just give me memories of my own experiences with assault, but even in these small everyday things that have happened to me as well, that wasn't necessarily someone assaulting me, but like someone harassing me, someone following me, someone talking to me in very coded language. Like all of those things make up so much of the kind of culture that we live in. I'll read out loud the quotes that I highlighted. It's a conundrum. If you survive, then the trauma, can't have been that bad. Being dead is the only way to prove it was. It really was bad. It was terrible. It was so awful, there was no way I could survive. Our society has a place for actual abusers, jail. There are systems and processes in place to handle them and rehabilitate them. The faith I grew up with demands forgiveness for abusers, but angry women, they must be silent. Abusers have a pathology. They have a system. They have restraining orders and court-mandated anger management classes. Once I heard a news story about sex offenders who had been driven out of their homes by laws mandating that they stay away from schools. A hotel had opened its doors to them so that they wouldn't be homeless. Even they had a place to lay their heads. My anger was still homeless. Maybe it did resonate with me because I don't really give myself space to properly deal with some of the things that I have dealt with. So definitely a lot to think about. On the flip side of things, the next audiobook that I listened to was Barbarian's Taming. They all blur together, but what had differentiated this book compared to the others is that the main character that's featured in this book is a fat woman. I think it's interesting that throughout the whole series, we get the same straight couple every time, and a very similar dynamic with the guy where he has to be this really big and burly man each time, but the human woman gets changed in the different font a little bit. So this time we get a fat woman. Great. However, I argue that this fat woman got paid dirty. So in the previous book before this one, there was a human woman that got kidnapped by one of the barbarians, but her love interest is this other guy that ends up saving her, because the barbarian that kidnapped her, he only snatched her up because he was so desperate to find a mate. If you find someone who you're supposed to be with, you will experience something called resonance, where there's gonna be like this pulsing sensation in your chest. It's kind of like having a soulmate, except this soulmate is gonna make you super fucking horny. Anyway, so this dude had snatched her up because he was so upset that he never found a mate. So the whole time he's complaining about this shit, it was really giving incel vibes. So guess who is his actual mate? The fat bitch right here in this book. There were a couple other things that made me side-eye too. Like, for example, this woman was constantly complaining about physical exercise and wanting to eat food, which is so valid because, you know, you are a human that is stranded on this foreign planet that's cold as fuck. But why does this girl have to specifically tell us that she keeps on craving McDonald's? It would be one thing if all the girlies were craving McDonald's and constantly talking about food, but like, why was this so focused on for the fat girl that we finally get in the whole series? Also, even though I say that the love interest did get better, every time he talks about the time that he kidnapped the girl, he always says that he regrets it because she was crying all the time and she was clearly miserable, and it didn't seem like he regretted it because he felt bad that he made her so miserable. It was more so the fact that he was like, oh, of course we weren't compatible after all, because all this bitch did was cry all the time. And it's like, hello, why wouldn't she cry when a fucking incel kidnapped her? And he literally had no positive things to say about her. And maybe that was to show how he's learned that you can't force who you get mated with, and he knows why they would be incompatible now because she was so fucking annoying to him. But why are you constantly talking shit about your lover's sister who she clearly cares about? And then the last thing that made me side-eye was this one part where the main character was giving her love interest a blowjob, and in order to make it more pleasurable for him, she decides to hum the Star Spangled Banner while she was doing that, I guess for the vibrations of his dick. I'm just against that because I don't support American patriotism. And that's all I have to say about that. Moving on, the next book that I read was House of Salt and Sorrow. This is a gothic YA story about a bunch of sisters who live in a manor by the sea. Specifically, 12 sisters. Imagine having so many siblings like that. I would fucking die. And in fact, some of them did. 4 of the sisters end up dying. Each time they do, it's like a tragic accident. The main character is one of the sisters, and she starts experiencing these ghostly visions that convince her maybe some of these deaths were not accidents after all. When it comes to atmosphere, the writing really went all in with the idea of living by the sea and the crashing waves and these possible ghosts that are living in the manor. But I did feel like a lot of it was kind of repetitive because they were constantly going to ballroom dancing. I do feel like for a YA story, there is bound to at least be one ballroom party. But these sisters were constantly sneaking off, going to these ballroom parties, and it felt like the plot was like, let's go to a ballroom party, let's go to another ballroom party, let's go to our third ballroom party. And this was happening so much, and then eventually we got to the gaslighting portion where you and the characters had to be like, wait a minute, what was real and what was not real? Who were we dancing with? Or rather, what were we dancing with? I would say if you love ballroom parties, this so far is the book that's had the most ballroom parties you've ever seen. After that, I listened to an audiobook called Good Morning Monster. This is a nonfiction book by a therapist who writes about 5 patients whose stories have really inspired her. What really got me was the first patient who was so belligerent against the author. She was constantly talking back to her therapist, being very skeptical and reluctant to do anything or improve upon herself. And it really made me realize how far away I am healed, because I actually was agreeing with her every time she was acting out. And I was like, you know what? I should be more of a bitch to my therapist too. Why not? If you're paying a bunch of money for this shit, you might as well just be vocal when you feel like your therapist is full of shit. I feel like in the past, I was trying way too hard to be, you know, very chummy and like respectable and rational, but really this is the only time when I should get away with being fucking unhinged. So every patient's story in this book is very tragic, very sympathetic, and I feel a lot for them. But what makes me feel really iffy was the therapist herself. I definitely think if you are a person of color, you should seek therapy from someone who is also a person of color, because they will inherently understand things that a white therapist wouldn't understand. And this is not a knock against white people, okay? Because every time I mention the word white, some white person gets triggered in my comments and accuses me of reverse racism. I'm just saying the same logic applies to, like, if you are a queer person, you should be talking to a therapist who is also queer and not straight, because straight people are not going to understand the kind of stuff that you go through. So in this case here with this indigenous patient, I'm assuming he probably didn't have much of a choice when he got prescribed to the author, who is white. And I do feel like the author tried as much as she could to kind of bridge the gap between their cultural differences. However, there are some parts where I was like, girl, he was talking about his experience being sexually abused, and he didn't understand why it had to be him, because this was from a coach where there were so many other teammates, and he didn't understand why out of all the people it had to be him among the team. And she replied that maybe it was because of his looks, and that part made him just go silent and then stand up and then walk out of the therapy session. And she was so surprised that that happened, and I'm like, yeah, girly, why the fuck would you say that? She then comes to find in the next therapy session that he reacted that way because he felt like by her bringing up his looks, it brought upon a lot of baggage that he's felt about his appearance. And the way that she framed it in the book made it seem like his reaction was disproportionate due to his trigger. But I would argue that regardless of whether that was a trigger for him, that's fucking weird to say in the first place. They kind of butt heads sometimes, because he does bring up the fact that she's white and that she might not understand some of the things that he's going through. And there's this one line that she says that I wrote down where she asked him, did it ever occur to you that not all native traditions are good, just like how not all white traditions are good? And I'm like, girl, stop. Stop! I was surprised that he would even give her permission to share his story, but then it turns out by the end of his chapter that by the time she tried to reach out to him, he already passed away. So now I'm like, what would he actually feel about you inserting his story into this book? Because the way that she frames it is that despite them, you know, clashing heads sometimes, they grew to understand one another. And I'm like, okay, that's your side of the story. I'm curious how he would actually feel about that. And I do feel like there are parts where she exemplifies self-awareness, because there's this one time where she suggests him to seek a spiritual native healing to compensate for white therapy, because she knew that whatever she was giving him was not enough. And that worked out for him, at least according to her words. So I do feel like she's aware that a lot of times psychotherapy has to be very culturally specific. However, there's so many little comments that she says that just make me cringe so much. Like there's this one time she says, I've never met anyone that looks more native than you. I don't know, girly. This is getting fucking weird. So she's sharing all these deeply personal traumatic stories of these people that she's treated, and it gets to the point where it feels like trauma porn. So I really don't know how I feel about the book. I have very mixed feelings. I feel kind of icky, and I don't fully trust her. But you know who I do trust? Miss Emily Wilde, because I read the first book last year, absolutely loved it. The sequel came out, Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands, and I devoured that shit. This author truly knows how to write cozy fantasies. She has mastered this to a a T. So Miss Emily here is a genius scholar of fairy folklore. The first book follows her writing the world's first comprehensive encyclopedia of fairies. You got to follow her adventure alongside her colleague, who is a professor but also a fairy secretly, and their banter throughout their whole adventure was so damn good that I couldn't wait to pick up the sequel and read more about it. Her new project is to create a map that focuses on the different fairy realms that are out there. So now she's on a new adventure exploring the Austrian Alps, and of course her boy toy fairy boy has to go alongside with her, and he's the biggest simp for her. And I totally understand, because Miss Emily here is serving cunt with her degree of cuntology from the University of Cuntridge. She is a smart badass bitch, and I love that she is so curmudgeonly and just wants to focus on her studies, but he makes his feelings for her well known, and she's like, I guess I will consider being in love with you. Like, it's just so cute. Here's a page that I highlighted. There's this one part where he asks her, is there a moment you would relive more than once? No, I replied, thinking uncomfortably of his power to reshape time, limited though it is. I'm rather fond of my sanity, thank you. He brushed a loose strand of hair from my forehead, tucking it behind my ear with one long finger. I felt the ghost of his touch trailing over my brow for some time afterwards. That would be mine, he said. Your hair is always in your eyes. I'm telling you, the man is so down bad for her. What do you mean he would fucking go back in time just to tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear? That's simp behavior. And now the book that you're probably waiting for because you clicked on the title due to me mentioning Omegaverse. Believe it or not, despite the furry allegations, I have not read an Omegaverse book before. And I decided to pick this book up because my partner, Victoria, is deeply embedded in the Omegaverse now. And this is one of the books that she read. And lo and behold, it's a fucking Reylo book. Who's surprised? Every time I read a contemporary romance book now, it's gonna be a Reylo book. Now here's what I've noticed, because you know, this is a Reylo author. Ali Hazelwood just published an Omegaverse book as well. And I also know that Kate Goldbeck, another Reylo author, is also into Omegaverse. Here's my theory here. Because we already have the Reylos starting to take over traditional publishing, because so many of them are also into Omegaverse, that's also how we're gonna get some ABO nodding shit into traditional publishing. I really do think it's because of the Reylos here. So now that I have accepted my fate being within the Reylo solar system, I have to also learn about their future child, which is the Omegaverse right here. And you can tell that's Omegaverse because there are paw prints. That should have been the clue right there. Imagine you pick up this book, you think it's just like a simple doctor contemporary romance, and you totally did not see the paw prints until it was too late. This is a romantic comedy about two doctors who also happen to be wolf shitters. My question is, how the fuck do they have time for this? Because my sister is a doctor and I never see that bitch. So these two decide to fake date, or rather fake mate, and their fake dating turns into a friends with benefits kind of situation. And then of course they realize that they genuinely love each other. I'm like, awesome, okay, good for them. But I have a question. When we get to the nodding part, because nodding is a part of the Omegaverse, and if you don't know what nodding is, let me tell you. Nodding is basically when the guy has his thing into you. I mean, I don't know how much I should say because I don't want to be demonetized, but you know, he has his thing into you. His thing swells into a knot, and then he's stuck there. You both are stuck there for quite a while. So now I have a question. They're knotted together, right? As a doctor, what if you were on call? Is this some kind of conjoined twin situation where you gotta waddle your way to the hospital? Like, what happens? What I have concluded from reading this book is that I think I am open to Omegaverse, but it has to be within a fantasy setting. I don't know if I could do Omegaverse in a contemporary setting because I'm like, sir, you are a doctor. I know you don't have time to be nodding like this. Not with those work hours, honey. I'm not going to the fucking ER and my doctor is stuck in a knot with some other girl. Could not be me. So the next book that I read was Nettle Bone. This is a fantasy standalone about a girl who has two older sisters, and she's experienced years of seeing her sisters being abused by a prince. Her oldest sister actually passes away. Her next sister is now married to an abusive prince, and that sister is constantly getting pregnant because she knows that if she is pregnant, at least the guy will not hit her. So the main character is actually someone who is not married, and she decides to join a convent instead. And I don't fucking blame her, because after seeing all the shit that her sisters went through, hell yeah, I would be a fucking nun too. So at some point she realizes that nobody is gonna be rescuing her sisters except for her. So she's like, I'm gonna dip out of my nun duties just this one time so that I can kill a man. There's a reason why the first sin came from a woman who ate, and I'm about to fucking serve right now. So she visits a grave witch to try to get the tools to kill a prince. But in order to do that, she has to complete 3 impossible tasks. So you follow her on this quest with the grave witch, a reluctant fairy godmother, a former knight and a chicken that's possessed by a demon. It's very random and weird, but it's also kind of giving cozy fantasy vibes in like a weird way. Obviously it deals with dark themes, but there's a lot of like playful elements to it. It's personally not my favorite, but I do feel like the writing has this timeless quality to it, which I think is really hard to pull off. The next book that I read is a memoir called More, and this is about the author's experience in an open marriage. So I was interested in checking out this book because I thought, hey, this personally is not my cup of tea, but I want to know what it's like for you. I want to know what different experiences are like. But I honestly feel like this book does more damage for the poly community. I truly feel like this book is not a good representation at all because this bitch was so messy and not in a good way. The way that this book was marketed made it seem like this was going to be a woman's journey of empowerment and embracing her sexuality by opening her marriage, and instead what we were seeing was how miserable she was being in an open marriage. The takeaway that I got from this is that straight people are not fucking okay. Because what do you mean that this was a mutual decision between the two of you and that this was a great thing for you to explore your sexuality? Meanwhile, you're spending half of the time crying over your husband sleeping with other people. What do you mean you're crying over your hookups that you don't even want, but you're kind of forcing yourself to do that because you feel insecure that your husband is sleeping with other women, and you're feeling jealous about the women that he's sleeping with? Like jealous to the point where when he tells you that he's seeing his ex-girlfriend because now you've opened up the marriage, that you feel like your whole world is coming down on you. That isn't normal. What do you mean that you are going to couples counseling and you are saying that you don't want to be in an open marriage, and your husband tells you, yes you do, I know you actually want to do this, but you're just not giving it a fair shot? I'm just saying, if your idea of an open marriage is to go to Ashley Madison, which is a cheating website, so that you can go sleep with other husbands whose wives do not know that he is sleeping with them, maybe that isn't actually being poly, because I thought the whole idea of being poly is that everyone consents. So if you are helping a man cheat on his wife with you because your husband wants to sleep with other people, which is an idea that you do not like because you get jealous every time he brings up the other women that he sleeps with, maybe this isn't poly, because it doesn't sound like everybody is consenting here. I think I'm gonna make a separate video about this book because so much bullshit happens that just makes me go, girl, what the fuck are we doing here? And then the 10th book that I read for the year is Giovanni's Room. This is the kind of book that if you were gagged by Call Me By Your Name because you love tragic gay men being sad that they can't be gay, and they're also kind of misogynistic on the side because they're sad that they're not gay, so they kind of had to hate women low-key, then this would be the book for you. It's a historical book about a man in Paris who is living with Mr. Giovanni, who is one very messy gay indeed. And he starts to have feelings for him, but he's very caught between the desires that he has for another man and knowing what should be normal or conventional because he's expected to marry a woman. I can certainly see how it's a queer classic because it takes place in the 1950s. You follow an American man going to Paris, but he's falling for an Italian man. All of these Eurocentric influences really gagging him as he's trying to figure out, should I cheat on my fiance with this man that I'm really hot for? I guess I will, but I'm also going to be very judgmental of anyone who's more feminine than me because I have a lot of internalized homophobia. Like, I hate so badly that I want to suck dick, so I will never admit this shit. It's definitely a book that shows how isolating toxic masculinity can be because he's so deep in denial that it just creates so much shame and misery. It wasn't for me personally. Maybe it's just because I'm tired of women getting the shitty end of the stick in every tragic gay male story. That being said, I do think that this story should have gotten the prestige and accolades and fame that Call Me By Your Name got. I would have much rather have this particular story than the other one here. So that wraps up the 10 first books that I read of the year. I feel like we went on a very chaotic roller coaster of all kinds of different stories. Believe it or not, it gets even more chaotic from here. So I will update you next time. Goodbye.
You act so curious, but am I for the better? Let's just stay till whenever, 'cause my heart can't take another promise forever. You wanna stay here together. You act so curious, but